This is a little tangential, but I mean, even...
We could go on this forever, Joy. I love it. I love it. If there's especially an authoritarian government, kids are just going to take it and accept it, and these cycles of war are going to continue.
Right.
But education, you have this opportunity to come in and say, okay, let's challenge different things.
You know, as a Christian even, like, I don't want to be reactionary. Like, I don't want to just react to situations around me. I want to be well-informed about what's happening, and I want to be able to respond.
I remember talking to God about his goodness once and just being like, I know you're good, but I live in a war zone, but I live in the rape capital of the world. And he just responded with like, but you know my goodness. And he's like, you get to live in the darkest places and still know that I am so good.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks, Cass.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have our dear friends, Cassandra and Edison Lee, in the house with us today. Cass and Edison are the co-founders of Justice Rising, as well as just dear friends of Expression 58, dear friends of myself and my husband and our family. It was just a delight to have you guys here in the building.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
Oh
Thanks for having us.
So fun.
Thank you for making the time. I know that you're in the middle of a busy travel season. So before we go any further, I know I just mentioned that you are the co-founders of an organization. Can you introduce to us a bit more about Justice Rising? Justice Rising is the name of your nonprofit. So what does this organization do? What is the vision behind it? Tell us more.
Yeah. Well, Justice Rising is a nonprofit that we started together, and the vision behind the organization is to transform war zones through education. So looking at conflict zones, places of war, and saying, okay, how do we actually bring peace? How do we not put a Band-Aid on things? How do we go deep into the foundations and bring peace? And education is such a powerful, brilliant way to do that. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything, but it's a way to really dive deep into culture and raise up the next generation to really build that foundation of peace that we're going after.
That sounds amazing. What was it? So going a little bit more into the background of you guys starting this organization, what was it that caused you to decide to start a nonprofit that was working in war zones, but also that was using this tool of education? Because obviously there are lots of organizations around the world choosing to target different areas of injustice, and specifically in places of war, we have organizations that focus more on the relief end of things and trying to bring healing in different ways. What was it that caused you to both have your heart broken for war zones, but also choosing this tool of education?
Yeah, we probably have really different stories about how we each came to that point. For me, looking at education, I knew I wanted to work in war zones since I was a little kid. I had been focused on the Congo for a really long time, and like, okay, how do we bring peace? How do we, such a strange kid maybe, just be like, how do we disrupt cycles of violence? And I traveled around as like in my early 20s to various war zones, from the Congo and southern Sudan and northern Uganda when Coney was there, and Middle East and all these different places, really asking the question, what do we do? What can I as an individual do? And I was in a refugee camp at one point, sitting there being like, if we don't actually disrupt cycles of violence, like sitting with a family, bullet wounds in the kid's back from when they were like running from war, just absolute poverty and devastation, being like, if we don't disrupt this from happening again, war is cyclical, it'll happen for this next generation, like for their kids and for their kids' kids, like what do we do? I was in that moment really praying and asking God, what's the solution? I don't just want to give out supplies, which is still great, but I was like, I really want to help this next generation. And feeling like education is the way that we're supposed to tackle this problem, and using that to reach communities and to reach the next generation and to really focus on that.
Yeah, and Cass already mentioned this before, but you know, education itself is not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix every single problem.
Yeah.
But, and especially when it comes to like such a huge problem like war, but at the same time, it's really difficult to rebuild after conflict and war and violence without a robust, strong education system. If you look at history, you look at all the major conflicts of the 20th century, you look, starting with World War II, and, education was actually used as a weapon of war in a lot of ways. Same thing in the 94 genocide. Education was actually exploited and leveraged by the state to sow even deeper divisions within culture and society. And so education by itself won't solve the problem, but it really does matter what you actually teach and how you go about teaching, and having that inclusive approach to education where it's not just a majority culture or population that is being disproportionately, taught and educated, but even the minority cultures, people who are often forgotten, the people who are marginalized, how are they included in the process of education or civics or whatever it may be? And so education is a big, big piece of any kind of post-war reconstruction.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's got me thinking about ways that we see that playing out even in our culture and society, conversations that are happening here in the States around what is allowed in our schools, what is not. I won't go too far into that. I'm not trying to get on a political stage, but there is something to that conversation around why people get so passionate about it, about conversations around what we are teaching our kids, because of that generational impact, and because of then what we are pouring into the next generation is going to be outplayed in potentially very violent ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we're not careful. I have here a quote that was pulled from your website. One of the head teachers that you spoke to in Syria, when he was asked about why education matters, he said the greatest tool to end terrorism is education, which I think really speaks into what you just shared, Edison, and just the ways that this has just the long-term impact, kind of talking about legacy as well as also just rebuilding what is currently happening. So when we're talking about education, is it kind of getting young people educated in the basics of maths and spelling and all of that, or is it also kind of imparting into them tools that they can use to rebuild their lives, I guess, and their communities, talking about like raising up leaders in, I know you guys are very focused in the Congo at the moment. So in that specific area, does the education piece also kind of, how do you as a young person rebuild your life to then go forward from there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really a combination of all those things that you mentioned. It's not any one particular thing that I think magically changes the outcomes and brings that transformation. I think when it comes to foundational literacy and numeracy, it is a huge, huge piece. If you don't know how to read and write and don't understand, you're not literate, it's just really hard to build your life, or even advance to secondary school or beyond that point. And so there's a lot of data and research out there too that foundational literacy and numeracy is so key when it comes to even future civic participation in democracy. And so unless you can get the foundations right and really kind of build on those early year skills, it's really difficult to construct knowledge on top of that later on. But of course, a lot of it has to do with even observing what is appropriate behavior, social emotional learning. I mean, even seeing how the teacher addresses these students. One thing that we see oftentimes in our classrooms is that, and this is something that we've really had to emphasize, is that oftentimes within the culture, in the different contexts that we're working in, and even here, I mean, I think there's almost this default to kind of have preferences for, boys versus girls, or, people who look like us, or whatever it may be. And so oftentimes we would see that girls were expected to clean up in the classroom while the boys would go outside and go play soccer or football. And so those are the really small things that you don't always pick up on, but those are learned behaviors inside of the classroom. And so how do you actually train and even teach the teachers to realize that who they are as individuals and what they model to the students, those are observed behaviors.
Yeah.
And it is so critical that the teachers and the school leadership really model good behavior to those kids. And that's where a lot of the character development comes in.
Yeah.
Well, and even critical thinking. And if you're teaching in the classroom, just whatever you hear is right. Don't challenge it. Just go along with the flow and that kind of thing. Then when they finish school, if there's especially an authoritarian government, kids are just going to take it and accept it, and these cycles of war are going to continue.
Right.
But education, you have this opportunity to come in and say, okay, let's challenge different things. Let's ask questions. Let's do research. Let's learn how to do research and what sources to look at and how to, tackle different issues. Then you're going to equip students that they finish school and they're going to start asking, okay, why has there always been war? How do we bring peace? What are solutions? And they can start, building the culture that they want to see.
Yeah.
This is a little tangential, but I mean, even
We could go on this forever, Joy.
I love it. I've got it looks like tears actually.
Yeah.
Water, but I'm gonna, you keep going.
yeah, but one of the things that we also focus on is doing original research. And that's something that even within the research and academic communities, you often have people in the global north that are leading research efforts, and people in the global south are simply, they're relegated to the role of research assistant, or they're just doing the data collection side. And so what does it look like to really build that research capacity in places like the Congo, or in places that are seeing protracted conflict, and have indigenous leaders really lead those efforts to find the solutions to the problems that they're experiencing? Because presumably the people who are experiencing the problems are the ones who likely have the solutions for it. And yet what we find is that the global north is often dictating or directing how these solutions should come about. And that's part of the reason that we so deeply rely on local leadership and local knowledge and try to leverage that as much as possible, because we know that as people who aren't from places like Congo or Iraq, we don't understand all of the problems and challenges. So how do we fully allow ourselves to kind of take a back seat and actively kind of divest power for ourselves and say, okay, let's allow local leaders to really kind of be in the driver's seat, and we can play a supporting role.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you mentioned that too, about who you have leading these schools in the Congo, because you hire all local teachers, right?
Yeah.
And so you're really talking about very transformational work that is happening, that it's not just filling a need, like this area needs schools, let's build a school, but you're actually talking about community transformation, as well as bringing healing, as well as building up the next generation of leaders. Like there's real community involved in your schools. And I know that you have 23, is that right? In Congo right now. I'd love to hear a little bit. I know from knowing you guys. Okay, I know some of the stories of that come out of your schools. How your schools really are pillars of the communities. I know that currently there's a lot happening in Congo, and your schools are. Some of them have been impacted by conflict presently, and you also have them. They're still running in the midst of things, and they're being used both as schools and also as shelters, right? If I'm correct in that. Yeah. I just wondered if you could speak into that and kind of give our listeners a little bit of an insight into the impact that your schools are having. I don't know if there's like any particular stories that you wanted to share, but knowing you guys and knowing, getting to hear it on a bit more of a regular basis, what's happening with Justice Rising, I'd love for our listeners to have a little slice of that.
Yeah. Oh gosh, we have so many stories. And our team, I feel like sometimes they don't even think to share some of the like really meaningful stories, and then we'll hear it later, like while we're having lunch someday, and we'll be like, guys, this is a really big deal. Like, why did you not think to tell us that? And they're like, oh, it's just kind of everyday things that happen. And we're like, that's a big deal. One thing that comes to mind, and again, we have so many stories of like housing different refugees and displaced populations. But one story that comes to mind is in a village just outside of Goma. And they've experienced a lot of war, a lot of violence. Even the land that we bought for the school, it's on top of a hill, and it used to be a rebel base during one of the wars and was used as like this lookout point. And we go in there, we buy this land, and we just have like problem after problem after problem. It's just like a hard community to get into. It's hard for them to trust us. The community has been through so much that they almost struggle to see the value of education because they're just trying to survive. Like they're just like, "Look, get me through today. I don't want to look at like raising up my kid to be able to do all these different things. I just need to survive right now." And so we just had so many issues, but we pushed through day after day, month after month, built the school, and started, recruiting students and all these different things. And by the end of it, we said, we're like, we are never building another school in this village. Like, this was exhausting. So many challenges. So many, like, soldiers coming and being like, well, if you don't give us this money, like, we will kidnap you kind of thing, like crazy stuff. And after about a year, we started, or even a few months into it, like after the first year, we saw so much change and so much transformation from the teachers to the parents. People were just seeing the value of education. They were starting to look beyond the survival of one day and starting to look beyond the future. It was like the school was bringing rest to the community, and it was starting to heal some of the old wounds from war. Again, there's a long way to go, of course, and they've cycled into violence several times, but it's just, we could see the difference. And one time we were visiting the school on like a regular site visit, and all the chiefs came to us. There were like 5 main chiefs, and they came before us, and I was like, oh no, is something wrong? Like, what's going to happen? And they came before us, and they were like, we just wanted to petition you. We want you to build another school here. They're like, this has brought so much hope and so much life to the community. Like, you have to build another school. And because things were going so well, we were like, okay. We started construction on another school in a different part of the village. And of course, it was hard and had so many challenges. But once again, we slowly saw over time how it shifts and how people start coming and seeking out the school, feeling like it brings this hope. So it was just one of those moments where you're like, it's so worth it to like persist and keep going.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that story, because actually in hearing that is a testimony to how what you're doing can disrupt cycles of war. Because you mentioned this earlier about the vision, or even the questions you were asking as a young person, like, how do we disrupt cycles of war? Like, God, what's the answer? And then hearing that story that you just shared is living answer proof, I guess, of like how building these schools and communities is disrupting cycles of war. Because prior to that, you were describing how this community, was so just in survival mode, and how bringing in a school, bringing in education, the hope that it brings, the different perspective, the transformative power of it is like just disrupting that pattern of survival that people have been stuck in, which is so powerful to hear. Okay, so we've talked about how you guys are currently focused on the Congo. You've been there for how many years have you been working there now?
Since about 2010, I would say.
Okay.
So about 13 years.
Yeah. Well done. That's
Not
amazing.
necessarily in the whole Justice Rising capacity, but working there,
Yeah.
and with schools in some way or another.
Yeah. And I know that, Edison, you were talking about research, and this has been like something that you guys have been focusing on a lot more in the last few years, and like researching in Congo, but also outside of Congo too. Is that right? And looking at other countries. Would you like to speak into a little bit of your vision beyond currently where you are focused, or where you have your schools?
Yeah, no, definitely. So up until this point, we've largely focused on operating our network of 23 schools. And so a lot of it, in fact, all of it has been just direct implementation. And I think that is so important and really, really needed, especially in the communities that we're serving. Cass already mentioned the community where we built those 2 schools in the village. Prior to that, kids were walking up to an hour in each direction just to go to school, and walking along pretty dangerous roads.
Road, yeah.
And so there were always security challenges there. So we recognize, and we certainly don't want to diminish the work that we've been fortunate enough to be a part of. And so I think that work is incredibly important. But up until now, we've only been able to serve about 4,000 students a year. And again, I don't want to dismiss that. I think that's so important, and obviously that's transformative for those 4,000 students. At the same time, we recognize if you look at the entire scale and the scope of the problem, there are 25 million kids who are living in active conflict that are unable to go to school.
And is this a global number?
Yeah, global number. And globally, if you look more broadly, there are over 200 million kids who are unable to go to school because of various emergencies or various forms of crises. Wow. And so it is a huge, huge problem. And we recognize that if we are solely focused on just building schools, we will not be able to really kind of address the problem in the way that it really deserves the attention. So for that reason, we've really been focusing on exploring different scale pathways and kind of go forward strategies in terms of, okay, how do we look at the global problem and how do we, as a small organization, really insert ourselves into trying to find scalable solutions. And so what we've been doing over the last, I don't know, maybe about a year or so, is really looking at developing innovative tools. We have a tool called the Chalkboard Guides, which is a structured pedagogy tool. Basically, it's just a teacher guide that's been adapted for post-conflict settings, but also looking at kind of mapping our existing model, really trying to codify that and say, okay, what is it that we're doing really, really well, and how do we translate and replicate that to different regions? And so one thing we're right now trying to figure out is how do we build out a global network of independent partners that can really implement some of the tools and programs that we've developed and proven over time. And so we've generated a lot of evidence for the work that we're doing. And we've been fortunate enough to have kind of an R&D hub, so to speak, within our network of schools. And so I think the next iteration or the next step, sometimes we kind of like to call it Justice Rising 2.0, which is kind of a wonky way to describe it, but yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking towards, is how do we find these partners and school operators in places like Somalia, South Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and really empower local actors and school operators and help them to build capacity so that they can be way more impactful. And so if we can build out this global network, all of a sudden we're not just impacting 4,000 students, but we're impacting hundreds of thousands of students and possibly millions of students. And that would be over time. Obviously there are some concessions there. We lose some control in terms of not being able to operate our own schools. But in terms of the breadth of the impact, I think over time that's going to leave a much larger mark in impacting students' lives.
That's amazing. So really, this research that you've been pouring so much time into is to take what you started, this seed almost, which is quite a pretty big seed, let's be honest. It's very significant. But making it accessible to people in other cultures and in other situations of conflict to be able to bring disruption to that conflict, essentially, right? And bringing in tools of the Justice Rising schools. Is that
yeah? So I think in a lot of ways, trying to upskill and build capacity for teachers and school leaders. Oftentimes in post-conflict settings, there's just so much fragmentation, and the education system's just been completely decimated. And so you're working in low resource settings. The schools never have enough money, never enough textbooks, never enough training for the teachers. And people are really desperate to build and grow their impact. And for us, we're fortunate enough to have been able to do this work in Congo over the last 13 years now. And so we're really trying to figure out ways to pass on what we've learned, but also learn from local actors in different contexts as well. And how do we actually have this exchange of knowledge and learn from one another to really create long-term impact.
Yeah. I love that. I'd love to ask you guys, You talk a lot at Justice Rising about being a peace builder. And I'd love to unpack that with you a little bit. I mean, we've obviously talked about what Justice Rising does, like on the practicals and where the vision is, and what has already been accomplished and what we're kind of moving into doing next. But within all of that, you guys are really modeling as individuals, but also as an organization, what it means to live as a peace builder. So your teachers, those who are running your schools in the Congo, who are living in active war zones, like full-time, they are full-time peace builders. You know, both of you travel internationally. You know, you live here in the States, but you travel much, and knowing you both, you live as peace builders in your community. I'd love to hear you speak into that a little bit. A, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a peace builder? If you can speak into that. And then also for our audience who is primarily based in the States, we're obviously in a different environment on a day-to-day basis to, say, the Congo or an active war zone, but there is active conflict that is happening in this country in different ways, whether that's political, whether that's religious, or all other things in between. From what you have learned and what you are doing and what you live out, are you able to speak into what it means to be a peace builder here as well?
Yeah. I think for me, when I look at kind of what happens in conflict zones and also in the States, and looking at, okay, how can I be a peace builder? What are signs of other people being peace builders? I would say there's a unity, bringing people together in it, and looking and saying, okay, how do we not other anybody? How do we not look and say, like overseas maybe being like, okay, well, we're from different tribes and there's a lot of history in this culture. How do we not look and say, okay, well, you're from this tribe, you're from this tribe, so we're going to other them and think of you belong in this slot and I belong in this slot. And in the States, even as you mentioned, like looking at politics alone, you can just say how often people are othered.
Yeah.
And kind of they're even trying to other people for like a righteous reason of like, well, I'm better because of this, or but I'm better because of this. But saying, okay, we're not going to other each other. We're not going to put those labels on each other, but we're going to work to bring us together and to talk about these issues and realize that we all have common ground and love each other through our differences. And I think being a peace builder is really making sure we're not putting each other in those boxes and othering. Yeah,
and I think it's also about living counterculturally and not simply going along with what is expected of you by society. And it's really, really hard to do. Obviously, much easier said than done. But when we look to our students who have experienced unimaginable trauma, and yet they can still choose to love their neighbors, even if that said neighbor maybe committed some kind of atrocity to their family member. That type of countercultural attitude and approach is something that I strive for every day. And situationally, it's become a lot easier moving away from LA because I don't have to sit in LA traffic anymore. But at the same time, but you know, like for us, you know, we are in some ways, and this sounds a little weird to say, but we're peace builders vocationally. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are in fact a peace builder. And so we constantly have to work on our inner lives to make sure that we're actually living it out, and it's not just a title, it's not just a label. And so that's something that we have to constantly work on and check ourselves. And I'll be the first to admit it. So I think that's a big thing. I think another thing is that we have to be really open to listening to each other and not just reducing these really complex problems into these monolithic things. I think that's something that we've seen in this 24-hour news cycle world that we now live in. Everything, it just becomes these bite-sized tweets or clickbait articles or whatever it may be. And it's so easy to just distill something into like this really catchy phrase or stereotypes or whatever it may be. But life is a lot more complex than that. And especially as citizens, as human beings, as Christians, it's our responsibility to really open ourselves up, our hearts, our minds, and really want to listen to where people are coming from, what their lived experience is. Because even if you don't agree with it, you've never walked in their shoes. And so what does it really look like to live counterculturally in that way and say, I don't understand where you're coming from. I may not agree with you, but I will choose to listen to you. And through listening over time, hopefully we can have a much more nuanced worldview and be a lot kinder to each other, because all of a sudden we start to understand and sympathize and empathize with one another.
I hope so. I have these conversations and my internal world is going, yes, exactly. That's exactly what I need to be doing more. Like, we need to be doing more. Yes, that's the goal. But it's beautiful to have this conversation, because it is a clear reminder of the life that we're called to lead. And I think the life that we all want. I don't think there's anyone who wants to be living in conflict, whether it's with the violence of machinery or the violence of attitude towards one another. No one wants that, but we find ourselves in moments of conflict all the time. Whether it's, you mentioned traffic earlier, somebody cutting you off. It's happened to me earlier. Bless the Lord. And everything reacts within you, and yet what we're talking about in this moment is having attitudes of kindness and love towards one another, to be able to hear somebody, but also to be able to be heard. We all desire that. And I think, what you both just touched on in that is, I'm sure, resonating with those who are listening, that, we want to be countercultural, and we want to be heard. We want to be listened to. We want to be able to lean in and listen to others. We don't want to other somebody. We don't want to be othered by somebody else. It's a very painful place to be in when that happens to you. From moving forward from that place of thinking about being a peace builder, challenging ourselves to embody that on a day-to-day, how does this conversation relate to our lives, do you think? What can we do to be more educated? What work can we be doing on our ends to lean into this conversation more? Whether it's I want to learn more about what it means to be a peace builder. I know there's a lot of books and things that we can learn from in terms of the ways of nonviolence. Dr. Martin Luther King talked a lot about that. I don't know if you guys have any input on that, if there are things that you would recommend in terms of those who might be listening and I want to take this conversation further. I want to learn more about how I can implement this in my life.
Yeah, even looking at our world, it's so easy to get kind of insulated and to look at our day-to-day, look at our city, and just kind of get trapped in our bubble a little bit and what concerns us here and now. And forget that actually, globally, what's happening really far away still does impact us. It just maybe doesn't affect us directly. Our world has been growing in conflict and crises for years now, and we have the most conflicts that this world has ever seen at one time going on, and we think, oh, well, it doesn't really affect us. And then all of a sudden, Russia and Ukraine happens, and we're like, oh, shoot, maybe it does affect us a little bit.
Yeah.
But things have been growing and growing for years now, and realizing that okay, this is going on and we do have a role that we should be playing in this. And how can we look beyond our city, and how do we look more globally? And I think paying more attention to that, hearing more stories and realizing how they could affect us, or how easily it could be me over there kind of thing. I think that's a huge thing that we have to be more aware of and more focused on.
I think this is just kind of piggybacking off of what I mentioned earlier about just listening and being open-minded about things. And I think that also applies to how we consume information and news as well. I think it's so easy, especially in the social media world that we live in. We're so there's such a temptation to kind of go into our little echo chambers and align ourselves or surround ourselves with people that think like us, that look like us, and what have you. But I think it's really about being exposed to different cultures and ways of thinking. I mean, even what Cass was touching on, that also speaks to that as well, about really thinking globally and looking beyond what we see as challenges here in the U.S. But I think a lot of it is just, how do we educate ourselves? How do we maintain this posture of curiosity and learning where we're constantly trying to challenge even our own notions of what we think we know? And maybe if other people think this way, there's a reason for it. And so how do we continue to learn and educate ourselves about different perspectives? And I think part of it starts with how we consume information and news. I think if we are listening to solely things that are on the left or solely things on the right, that's going to affect our worldview in a really meaningful way. But if we can really diversify the sources of news that we're consuming, or the people that we're interacting with, or really kind of getting out of our comfort zone to talk to someone who looks very different than ourselves, I think that's a start. But I think it's a really important start.
Well, that comes back to the othering. Like, if you're like, oh, but I can't listen to that because this person, well, I'm better than that, or my values are better, or whatever. And you start to be like, oh, did I just completely other them? And like, that's not building peace.
Yeah. I heard Brené Brown talk about this a couple of years ago, and talked about the dehumanization culture that we now live in. And we've become very comfortable with it. We very easily, without thinking about it, can dehumanize somebody else simply because they are from a different political party or different culture or a different worldview from us. And really, when she was talking about, she was really challenging the room to kind of look at themselves afresh and be like, well, you look at this other group and see them as the ones that are dehumanizing you, but you are actually throwing the same behavior right back.
Right.
You know, it's like, oh, okay. So guys, I want to ask you, how do you both stay soft in the midst of working in and being so focused on communities and areas and things that are happening around the world, locally, or everything that is very challenging? How do you keep your heart soft? How do you keep laughing?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
For me, that's the Jesus part. Like, it's not easy. And I remember one time we were working a lot in the village in a really war-torn area. Horrific war going on, had just fled from several raids. And we kept going back in after all these raids, and just seeing the poverty and what people had gone through. I remember we were driving on this road, and I literally closed my eyes as we were on this road, and I was like, Jesus, I can't see it anymore. I just cannot see it anymore. Like, it's too hard, and it's everywhere. Like, everywhere I looked. And Jesus was kind of like, well, it's not yours to carry. Like, if you don't want to see it, like, just put it back on me. Like, lay it at his feet. And it doesn't make it easier in the exact moment. Like, you still have to realize, if you want to stay soft, like, there's going to be a rough road that you're going to have to face. But letting yourself go through that, letting yourself experience the pain and the injustice happening. Like, it's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
And if we think, oh, I'm just going to like scoot over injustice and it'll be fine, that's just not possible. It hurts. And I think often that is why we keep looking in front of us, and we don't want to look at like global injustices, because we're like, well, it hurts and it makes us uncomfortable. But in order to stay soft, you have to be okay with being uncomfortable and going before Jesus and being like, I don't understand. This really sucks and it really hurts. Yeah. And just letting yourself feel it, and then leaving it there and being like, okay, Jesus, now I'm going to leave this at your feet. I'm going to instead pick up your joy or pick up your peace and continue to live in that uncomfortable spot. But the whole like giving him your burdens, like, that's a real thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that as someone shares an encounter moment like that, or a personal memory of how God has met them in the midst of something, it allows you to kind of step into it for a second and receive what God was saying to you for yourself, And I think we all have those moments where we feel overwhelmed, or just, even you talking about the pain point, like we encounter injustice every day, whether it's seeing something on social media or it's encountering something in a very personal experience, and being reminded that God is able to carry the weight of those injustices for us, I think is really powerful. So thank you for sharing that and reminding us. And I know it's one of those moments where you want to be able to click your fingers in a conversation and make everything fine. Well, thanks, guys. And it's not, right. You both a testimony to the fact that this is a long-term journey and commitment to seeing justice rise out of the ground, right?
Yeah.
And, we as believers and as people in community together want to be invested in that long-term commitment. And that there's this tension that we carry as believers of, God, we know that you are one who promises to make all things new, that you are good, and you are a redeemer, and you are hope and joy and life and all those things. And yet here we are, and we're still trucking through a world that is full of beauty and also pain, and yet being reminded of, that we walk in this tension, and yet God is with us in the midst, even if we're still got to keep going along this road, and yet knowing that I can give God my burden that I'm feeling in this moment is a really important reminder.
Yeah, I remember talking to God about his goodness once and just being like, I know you're good, but I live in a war zone, but I live in the rape capital of the world, but someone I know was beheaded in the village the other day, but there were so many buts. And he was like, he just responded with but you know my goodness, you get to see, and he's like, you get to live in the darkest places and still know that I am so good.
Wow.
And he's like, you get to be one of the happiest people because you get to hold that tension. You get to see the injustices and know that my goodness is even better. And I was just like, okay, you are that good.
Wow.
So even though there's so many evils, knowing that he's actually still better.
Yeah. I mean, the promise of the gospel is not that we're going to live a pain-free life.
Right.
But in the midst of pain, it's Emmanuel, God with us, that he walks in that pain with us. And I think that's such a good and important reminder. And even for me right now, this is a great reminder.
Same. Yeah. I kind of want to cry now.
And also for us, in terms of how we keep our hearts soft as well, we also have good therapists. So that always helps.
Yes and amen. Jesus plus therapy. Amen. I'm with you. Wow. Okay. I wanted to, sadly going to have to wrap up the conversation in a second, but I wanted to close by mentioning last month in April, you were running your Expand campaign, which was amazing. And it was basically an invitation for people to invest in Justice Rising and the expansion. So that kind of a lot of what you've already mentioned. But I don't know if you wanted to share any more around the Expand campaign. I know that we have moved out of April, but it was one of your more recent campaigns, and just ways that people can partner with Justice Rising in any way, and kind of what you guys are continuing to do. And if there are ways that people can get connected with you guys from this point of, I'm sure what you have shared today has connected with people, but what would be ways that they can partner with you in different ways, and where are you headed next?
Yeah. Looking at our Expand campaign, as we talked about, the different war zones we're going after, and taking the Justice Rising way and bringing it to, Edison was saying, Somalia and South Sudan and all these different places we're dreaming for. The Expand campaign really helps us do that. And there's that phrase that says, it takes a village to, raise a child. I'm it takes a village to raise a nonprofit. It really takes our global community standing with us to accomplish these things. And our peace partners are a great example of that. each Justice Rising student has school fees that they have to pay for school, and that's just that's a national thing in the Congo. But we realize that a lot of kids can't pay that because of war and because of poverty. So our peace partners come and support the school fees, and it's $5 for a child for a month. So we kind of push people and say, like, hey, can you take on 5 kids for $5 a month and help those kids get this amazing education? So people can sign up to be a peace partner or give to campaigns like the Expand campaign or give to Justice Rising to see us take this transformative model into other conflict zones around the world. And yeah, we've really seen that our donor community, it's not just like a give and go. It's like investing and being a part of the transformation. I know I just said transformation, but like we believe it so much that people are really joining together with us to see the change.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks, Cass. Is there anything that you would like to leave the listeners with before we close out today? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I mean, I think for me, it really is just about maintaining that attitude and posture of curiosity and learning. If there's only one thing that I hope people will walk away with, is this idea that we never stop being learners. We never stop, learning about new cultures and people and things that are going around on the world, and what we learn allows us to better assess the world around us and how to respond. As someone who, as a Christian even, like I don't want to be reactionary. Like I don't want to just react to situations around me. I want to be well informed about what's happening, and I want to be able to respond in a really wise and methodical way. Yeah. And so I think if there's just one thing that people can walk away with, I hope I hope that they'll want and desire to kind of stoke their curiosity and this attitude for learning.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, my dream for the church is that they would really look at the world's injustices or like war and conflict, and they would get back to the place of like, oh, Jesus is peace. Jesus lives in us. Like we get to go and bring peace. And that the church would be able to embody that to the point where everyone says, oh my gosh, something's going on. What do we do? Let's go find some Christians and ask them what to do. Like that we'd be so hands-on with bringing peace around the world that it would be what we're known for. And I'm not sure we're known for that right now. So I think it takes little steps every day to get there. It's not just going to be this, bam, we're there. But it takes those little steps. And so I'd encourage people, if you don't know where to start, like partner with someone like us, partner with Justice Rising to start taking steps towards building peace. Look in your own life, in your own community, and start taking those little steps that the world would look and say, okay, I need a Christian because I need peace in my life. I need those answers.
Yeah. Thank you both for leading the charge in this. You have both poured in so many years, hours, tears, dreams into living a life of someone who is a peace builder. And I know it's a constant learning road that you're on, but thank you for leading us, leading so many people in this charge. Thank you for what you've deposited today. I know that you have a social media, Instagram, people can follow your website, people can look at too for more information and ways that they can partner with you guys. We love you. We're truly thankful for what you're doing. And for those of you who are listening, I pray that you follow along, you have taken notes, and you take the charge because it's a good one. It's an important one. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks for having us. We love you guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the LCJ podcast. We hope that this conversation blessed you. If you want to know more, please look in the description for more links and follow the Expression 58 socials to keep up to date on what we're doing. If you'd like to support the creation of this podcast, please consider donating. Visit expression58.org/podcasts for more information. We'll see you next time.